The institutional fear of the number was what? That it would...
The U.S. Department of Labor administers the minimum wage law.
I see.
And the money and the careers of perhaps a third or some other significant percentage of the Labor Department's resources come from administering the minimum wage law. One of the real farces of all this is that the law itself, Section 4D, I still remember, requires the Labor Department to study the employment effects of minimum wages. And those studies are absolutely a farce. In fact, some years after I left, I did an article saying why those studies were a farce. And when I came back later on to the Labor Department to do some research, one of the older librarians who remembered me turned to the younger librarian and she said, "This is the man who wrote that article that has everybody up in arms."
So you began to be dissuaded of Marxism
and of government in general, because the government is not out there as a personification of the national interest.
Right.
They have their own interests, and the Labor Department was clearly an interest in keeping the minimum wage, because that's their jobs and careers and power.
Which brings us, if I may, to one of my favorite books, your 2000 book. This is a beat-up old copy.
Mm-hmm.
This book, Conflict of Visions.
Yes.
Which you published in 2007, and you lay out. I'm sorry.
1987.
I beg your pardon. 1987.
Reprinted in 2007.
Well, beat up as this book is, it turns out this is a reprint. Sorry, 1987, and you lay out two competing ways of looking at economics and policy. Really, two competing ways of looking at life that go back at least 200 years: the constrained vision and the unconstrained vision. The constrained vision, I'm quoting from A Conflict of Visions, sees the evils of the world as deriving from the limited and unhappy choices available, given the inherent moral and intellectual limitations of human beings, close quote. So the constrained vision understands itself as constrained by the limitations of reality itself.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
In other words, they cannot proceed as so many do, that good things happen automatically, but bad things are somebody's fault.
Got it. And then to continue here, the constrained vision, again, quoting from A Conflict of Visions, for the amelioration, improvement of the human condition, the constrained vision relies on certain social processes, such as moral traditions, the marketplace, or families, not government. So explain that. Why do we rely on processes rather than the will of the people instituting changes to improve our condition?
Well, it doesn't ignore government. Even for the market to work, you have to have a government. As Europe discovered when the Roman Empire collapsed, and the economies collapsed also. But I guess one of the reasons would be that with the government you have surrogate decision makers, and they cannot possibly know as much as the individuals whose personal decisions have been preempted.
I see. All right, which brings us to the unconstrained vision. When, again I'm quoting you, when Rousseau said that man is born free but everywhere in chains, he expressed the essence of the unconstrained vision, in which the fundamental problem is not nature or man, but institutions.
Yes.
Would you explain that one?
Well, he has the notion that, again, that good things happen naturally. And if they're bad things, it's because institutions, including civilization itself, have made these bad things happen. And of course, and I think that's really the implicit assumption behind a lot of things that are said on the left today. And why in my most recent book I go to a lot of trouble to show that in nature there's nothing resembling equal opportunity. That wherever you look around the country, around the world, you find people who live up in the mountains, poor and backwards, even in the richest country, including the United States. Mm-hmm. I believe the poorest country in the United States, county rather, was in a mountain community, which was almost 100% white.
Somewhere in Appalachia, West Virginia, Southern Ohio, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And the men in that county had a life expectancy 10 years less than men in a county in Virginia.
And the unconstrained vision says, let's fix that. Surely we can pass a law that would improve that. And the constrained vision says, well, now wait a moment. If people who live in isolated pockets in mountains are poor and backwards all around the world, and we see this pattern over and over and over again, maybe there's something very deeply rooted in reality about that that's hard for us to get at. Correct?
Yes.
All right. So, in the book, A Conflict of Visions, you're very dispassionate and very analytical, and you lay out the unconstrained vision, and you lay out the constrained vision, and you don't really come out blazing in favor of one or the other.
No, that is not a book meant to show that one vision is better than the other. It's there to show you what they are and what you're assuming if you go one direction or another.
Okay.
And it's to encourage people to understand the implicit assumptions behind all this, without which you're just at loose ends.
All right. So, pondering all this, I noticed something, a column that you wrote, this is a couple of years ago, in which you rebutted Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times. And Kristof had ascribed the gaps between African Americans and whites in America, gaps in wealth, gaps in educational achievement, the usual gaps, to, and this is a quotation from Kristof, to the lingering effects of slavery, close quote.
Oh, yes.
And here's Tom Sowell, quote, if we wanted to be serious about evidence, we might compare where blacks stood 100 years after the end of slavery with where they stood after 30 years of the liberal welfare state. In other words, we could compare hard evidence on the legacy of slavery with hard evidence on the legacy of liberals, close quote. And so there it is, life is hard. You use the word hard, you use the word serious, you use evidence. Tom Sowell is a man of the constrained vision through and through and through, correct?
Yes.
No.
Yes, part of a vanishing breed, I might add.
So when you were a Marxist, the notion, explain that, because the Marxism.
Well, but no, you see,
so that's complicated.
even when I was a Marxist, I had the same intellectual standards.
Right.
And that's what eventually led me away from it.
Oh, I see.
In other words, I hadn't done all the research. I hadn't gone around the world